Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'd like to say welcome to the Barnes & Noble at Boston University. As part of our ongoing author series, we are pleased to present Assistant Professor of Religion Donna Freitas in discussion of her newest book, Sex and the Soul, Juggling Sexuality, Spirituality, Romance, and Religion on America's College Campuses. Sex and religion, they seem to be mutually exclusive concepts these days. If someone is religious, they are assumed to be chaste, and alternately, sex has less and less to do with one's religious beliefs. It may not surprise you to discover that evangelical students do not take part in the hookup culture so prevalent in today's college campuses. But astonishingly, Catholic students find no connection between their faith and their desires, despite their religion's abstinence teachings. This is just one discovery Dr. Freitas made during her study, Sexuality and Spirituality in American College Life, an outgrowth of her St. Michael's College course on dating. This study brings to light the personal stories and inner truths behind the potentially dangerous misperceptions created in today's campus culture. Boston University's own Stephen Prothero, author of Religious Liturgy, Religious Literacy, praises Donna Freitas' work, saying, "At the heart of this path-breaking and heartbreaking book are the stories of college students searching alone for ways to bring their bodies into the conversation with their beliefs. Smart, learned, beautifully written, and above all humane, this book should jumpstart a national conversation on how the sexual revolution has trapped students as much as it has freed them." Dr. Freitas is also the author of Killing the Imposter God, Philip Pullman's Spiritual Imagination in His Dark Materials, and Becoming a Goddess of Inner Poise, among others. She is a forthcoming young adult novel entitled The Possibilities of Sainthood, and is a regular contributor to BeliefNet, Publishers Weekly. Her work has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Christian Century, and School Library Journal, and she has commentated for NPR's All Things Considered. And now please join me in welcoming someone who's going to be considerably less tongue-tied than I was today. Please welcome Professor Freitas.
Thank you all for coming. There's a lot of people here. So I'm feeling really short. And I'm one of those, I think what I might do, if this is okay, is I'm going to move the chair over and just stand. I'm one of those people who likes to see everybody. So I'm going to move this over here, and hopefully the mic will catch this. So thank you all for coming tonight. And I think sometimes if you put sex in the title, people show up, huh? So, and Oxford, the publisher, wasn't shy about making that word big on the cover. And it's funny, when I'm gonna sit on this. We'll see if, I'm trying to be appropriate since this is being filmed. My students know that I'm very informal in class. Okay, so one of the things that was sort of amusing at the publisher, it's a university press, and they were very excited to do a book on sex. So they were all excited about the different possibilities of how they could publicize this. And when they showed me the cover, I was like, wow, look at that. I wrote a book about sex, apparently. And my other confession is my father still doesn't know the topic of this book, and I haven't told him that it's out. So anyway, you could tell that I come from a Catholic background. So the reason why I wanted to start by just talking about why I did this book, or why I started this project. And Jean referred to this dating class I taught at my old school, which was St. Michael's College, a Catholic college in Vermont. And it was quite a surprise on campus when a dating course showed up, offered from the religion department. It was offered in the religion department and gender studies. And the course filled up in about 20 minutes. And I had lines out my door and getting phone calls off the hook in my office with students who wanted to add in. And I was sort of surprised by how many students wanted to be in this class. And I remember telling students who were coming to my office, saying it wasn't a how-to. We were gonna look at dating in an intellectual, reflective way and through the lens of theology. So anyway, a very curious thing happened during that class, and that is about halfway through the semester, my students had come back from spring break, and we had spent a lot of the course discussing sex and pondering spirituality. Students came to the class because they were really interested in spirituality, but then the experiences of my students were really predominantly in the realm of sex, I guess you could say. And so they spent a lot of time discussing their own sexual experiences and then trying to wrestle with Catholic theology, with different philosophers what we were reading. We read the Song of Songs, what most students actually didn't know existed. It's in Hebrew scripture. Raise your hand if you've read the Song of Songs. You should go read it. It's really racy. So anyway, we were pondering these ideas, and so they came back from spring break, and one of the students said, essentially that she was hooking up all the time, and it really made her unhappy. Like, why was she doing this? You know, she really was just ambivalent about it. In fact, she hated it. And then suddenly, the entire room erupted, and they agreed with her. And they were all shocked to realize that every single person in the room felt like they needed to pretend to like hookup culture on campus, but that they actually didn't really like it. And so once they figured out that they all felt the same way, and they had all spent all these years, most of them were seniors, pretending to like hookup culture and pretending to like to participate in it, they got really upset. And they felt kind of duped that they had been, they really wanted different kinds of relationships than they were having. So they decided to write a full-fledged newspaper to pass out to everyone and anyone on campus who would listen, professors, other students, ideally the college president. And this is the experience that launched this study for me, or this project. And I wanted to read to you just briefly a couple of excerpts that I have from the newspaper. And this is in the preface. I tell the story of this class in the preface of the book. So they wrote a mission statement that was at the top of this newspaper. And I guess I'll tell you one funny anecdote. We went back and forth about titles. My student's favorite title was Holy Sex for the nursepaper, and I was like, no. Let's just subtitle it, Don't Fire Professor Freitas. So we weren't going with Holy Sex, and then their other favorite was the missionary position, and I was like, no. And that's all very funny, but again, let's not get Professor Freitas fired. And then one of the students came up with Dateline, and so it ended up being Dateline SMC, Dateline St. Michael's College. And so right underneath the mast, which they designed, and I remember we did something like Volume 1, Issue 1, because it made it look like a real newspaper, and then all these people were coming up to us after, like, when's the next issue? And I was like, are you kidding? I'm so tired. We're never doing this again. So, but anyway, this was their mission statement. We, the students of RS 350, Dating and Friendship, believe that an honest conversation about sex, love, intimacy, hooking up, dating, and other relationships found on campus is both valid and necessary. Although these issues are widely discussed post-weekend debauchery, they are rarely spoken of with depth and maturity. We have benefited from addressing such issues in a spiritual context within our classroom and want to extend the opportunity to the rest of our college community. We invite not only the students, but the faculty, staff, and administration to participate as well. We hope you enjoy. And I was very proud of them. So they decided to do this mission statement on their own, and then each of them picked a topic. And they all wrote articles, and generally, the way I described it was they started with their own experience, which generally had to do with sex on campus, and then they crept towards theology and religious wisdom. And it made quite a splash on campus, to say the least. And one of the things that the motivation that I saw in those students was so profound to me, that students would take such a risk on their college campus. And this was a small campus of about 2,000 students, so everybody knew everybody else. And here were these 21 students who put themselves out there and said, we're going to talk about hookup culture, and we're going to talk about how we don't like it, and that we all found out that we would like to change it. And that kind of motivation to me, and the strength in numbers they found, was really interesting. And so I started to wonder, wow, so hookup culture is so predominant, and I'm on a Catholic campus. I wonder if other Catholic campuses have the same sort of peer ethic or peer experience where the Catholic school is saying, we're all about abstinence, we love abstinence here, but the actual student experience is totally different. I wonder if I go to a non-religious college, will the experience be very different? And so with the help of the 7 rising seniors from that class, who were my research assistants, I developed a study, and I decided to go exploring at different colleges and universities. I picked 4 different college types. I went to other Catholic colleges, obviously, because I was curious, in relation to St. Mike's. And then I went to evangelical Christian colleges. I went to non-religiously affiliated universities and also public universities. And I wanted to see, I wanted to talk to students there, but I also wanted to see if the campus culture was different depending on the university affiliation. So, that's what sparked the study. And this book is actually dedicated to those students and my research assistants for this project. So it was very much a joint effort, I think, both in terms of my own research. I've asked questions about dating and sex in relation to religion for a long time, but it was the first time I really did that in conjunction with my students. And so a lot of the questions that I went around asking at different colleges were questions that my students were like, you have to ask this question because we want to know. And one of the things that I really learned from them was I couldn't just ask what people thought about themselves. I had to ask what everybody else thought too. And so I would ask, so basically I always ask 2 sets of questions. What do you think everybody else thinks about this? And what do you think about it? And it was amazing because student after student would tell me that everybody else felt this one way, but they felt differently. Except everybody feels the same. They just think everybody else feels a different way. So I found that there was this big disconnect between the perception of what's going on campus, especially with regard to sex and hookup culture, and then what students actually want or what they hope for themselves. And so time after time, I heard this from students. And if it wasn't for the way you do a study, you can't actually, you can't really be talking about what other students have said. But I felt this desire sometimes after hearing again and again from different students on campuses, like, well, I'm supposed to be hooking up, but I really hate it. No one else feels that way. Everybody wants to date you. Nobody actually wants to hook up. So that's one of the startling things I think it was for me when I was doing this study. But anyway, with regard to sex and the soul, I thought I would talk specifically about, there were so many different students that I found interesting, but it was very fascinating for me to go to evangelical campuses. And evangelical Christian colleges were the only colleges that stood out in any way different than all these other schools. And so with regard to hookup culture and with regard to religion. So one of the things that I've had a lot of Catholic parents writing me, very concerned to hear that it seems like it doesn't matter if you go to a Catholic campus, you're still going to find the same sorts of statistics about sex and hookup culture as you will at any other college. And the only college that's different, colleges that showed up as different are evangelical ones. And so anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about evangelical campuses and why they're so different. Because for all intents and purposes, even though I think it was about 80% of students on average at all these colleges and universities, whether Catholic or private or public, identify as religious and or spiritual to some degree. So 4/5 of students identify as religious and or spiritual to some degree on all these campuses. Even though most students don't talk about that with each other. So there's a lot of religious and spiritual desire, but it often goes unexpressed. And then at evangelical colleges, what I experienced was that you have religion is the center of everything. So Christianity is the center of campus, it's the center of who you are, it's the center of how you construct your identity. And everything flows from there, including sex. And so you can't talk about sex on campus without also talking about religion. Whereas at all the other places, you could talk about religion, and you could talk about sex or spirituality, and you could talk about sex. But it was really hard for students to see them in relation to each other. It's as if they have to be divorced. So anyway, since I'm guessing most of this audience might not be familiar with evangelical Christian campuses, since BU is not one, I thought I'd talk a little bit about what I found there. And one of the things that was really interesting was the longest interviews I had were with evangelical Christian students, and partly because they had so much to say about their faith, but they also had a lot to say about what their faith says about sex. And while most students on campuses where there is hookup culture expressed a lot of dismay about hookup culture, the opposite, so it's not like all is wonderful on evangelical campuses. It's very different, but what most of those students feel, or a lot of them feel, is extreme pressures in terms of sexual restraint. And so one of the chapters I have in the book is about purity culture. And has anybody heard of purity? Does anybody talk about purity in general? Is that a regular? So purity language generally not a part of. Purity language was something that was generally specific to evangelical campuses, though I do think that other colleges have their own version of it. But it's a whole different ballgame. So purity culture within evangelical youth culture has to do with keeping yourself pure sexually until you get married. And so getting married is the goal. And so this creates all sorts of complications for sexual minorities, as you might imagine. But most of the students you meet will be trying to stay pure. And there's different kinds of purity. There's spiritual purity, and then there's physical purity. And spiritual purity has to do with even if you become physically impure, there are ways of becoming spiritually pure again. But once you've lost your physical purity, that's it. And there's, in a sense, you're sort of ruined. And so a lot of the young women, especially that I talked to, were really concerned about losing their purity. So I wanted to talk a little bit about one of those students who was really interesting, and that'll be a very short reading, and then you can ask me all the questions that you want. But a couple of things before I read from her story. Just so you know, there's all sorts of boundaries that students set up in purity culture, having to do with how they're going to sort of navigate getting to the altar without ruining themselves. And they really ranged. So, I wanted to give you the range. So the basics that I found, and most of them are on the front end of the scale here. So purity culture, aspiring to purity until you got to the altar, meant anything from any one of the following. Waiting till the wedding ceremony for the first kiss. Waiting till you're engaged for the first kiss. Trying to avoid all lustful thoughts or feelings of sexual desire prior to marriage, and some of these are both and. Dressing modestly, especially for women. Restricting kissing to public places as a way of preventing further sexual intimacy. Kissing only while standing up. Kissing while lying down but avoiding any other sexual contact. Kissing and touching but never achieving orgasm. Engaging in, quote, everything but intercourse, including oral and anal sex. And some students said they thought anal sex was okay in theory, though not one of the evangelical students I interviewed acknowledged having had anal sex. And so there's this pretty big range. And I think the number was something like, I interviewed 13 or 14 students, many of whom were seniors who had never kissed anyone before. So I had to even shift the way I asked questions when I went to evangelical colleges, because at other colleges, if a student told me they were in a relationship, I would often jump to, have you ever had sex? And at evangelical colleges, the first time I did that, was interviewing someone who had been in a relationship for 2 years, and so I said, have you ever had sex? And he looked at me and I said, have you ever had oral sex? Have you ever touched a girl? And then finally I was like, have you ever kissed your girlfriend? And he said, no. And I said, oh, okay. So anyway, so I learned to not to assume that if someone said they were in a romantic relationship that they would be kissing that person. And anyway, but the student I want to tell you about, these are all pseudonyms, obviously, but I called her Jessica Marin, and she was at an evangelical university, and she had never kissed anybody before. So I'll tell you a little bit of her story and see if you find it interesting. So the title of her story is called Unusual Wedding Present. And all the students I interviewed, they're sort of narrated. So most of this book is student stories, but this is just one of them. Jessica Marin is a shy 19-year-old sophomore at an evangelical university in the Midwest. Initially in our conversation, she presents a nervous demeanor, but after a few minutes, she warms up and becomes more animated. Jessica considers herself both spiritual and religious and had a strong Christian upbringing. She comes from a military family, and her father is a highly decorated member of the U.S. Army who served as the uncontested spiritual head of his home. During our conversation, Jessica recounts how her father was prone to spontaneously deciding such things as who would conduct the evening prayer before dinner. He demanded unquestioned and immediate obedience from everyone in the room. It should not be surprising that Jessica's description of her relationship to God is one of ultimate authority and utter submission, with God playing the role of the authoritarian father and her the part of the dutiful daughter. This idea of God is comforting to Jessica. She expresses relief that God is in charge of her college experience, so she does not have to carry this burden. On the purity meter, Jessica tilts heavily to one side. She has never dated anyone. She has never so much as kissed, touched, or been touched by a boy. Jessica is working to keep pure until marriage. She plans to receive her first kiss at the altar. She says that her friends do too. We all want to be pure when we get married, and we're all working at keeping that as a gift, Jessica explains. Talking about her purity, which for Jessica means both physical virginity of the body and spiritual virginity of the mind, as a gift prompts Jessica to laugh nervously. She says that although guarding their purity is serious business for her and her friends, there is also something silly about the notion of a girl's purity as a present for her future husband. She shifts uncomfortably as she ponders what feels off about this common expectation for evangelical young women. It's the "here you go, happy wedding" part that Jessica says she finds weird, as if on her wedding day she literally becomes a gift for her husband. I do think it is a gift that we can give to our spouses, she says, her voice more hesitant now than confident. But just tossing it around like, I'm his present, I guess it's just kind of silly to imagine what that could look like. Like, untie me, unwrap me. The it that is tossed around, making Jessica so uneasy, is, of course, herself. Jessica is the untouched body, the unblemished heart, and the innocent mind that becomes the present that shows up wrapped in a white gown at her wedding. It is her duty to finally allow a man, her spouse, to unwrap her later that evening. Jessica leaves little doubt about the sincerity of her belief in the God-given responsibility to remain pure for her future husband. But her talk about the silliness of this duty points more to the discomfort she feels when thinking about her wedding night than to something she and her friends find genuinely amusing. Her body language, the starts and stops in her speech, the nervous pauses, the eyes that refuse to look straight ahead, all reveal anxiety about the idea of sexual intimacy. Her mannerisms say that what her words do not. After a lifetime defined by a battle to remain pure, she will suddenly be expected to give up the fight and let go into a previously forbidden realm. And one of the things I talk about is how Jessica really, that idea of saving yourself to be this gift, to be this present, that you're wrapped up in a white dress, is this classic challenge that all of these young women I interviewed on evangelical campuses faced. And so there's this idea that so one day God will reveal to a man that which wife he is to marry, at which point the man will start a chaste courtship. And in the meantime, the woman is to wait patiently and submissive to God's will. So the woman's real job in this situation is to guard herself from missteps that could derail this romantic ideal. And so Jessica talks a lot about giving God total control over her dating life, and she wants to marry who God wants her to marry. She specifically says that, and she also talked about how God already knows who she's going to marry, so why would she mess with this? And so she talks about surrendering herself totally over to God. And then one of the things that was really interesting to me about Jessica was the discussion we had about her promise ring. And this is a big part of purity culture. And if some of my students from my class last semester that I taught on this book are here, but we talked a lot about abstinence pledges and purity and promise rings. And I'm sure many of you have heard all sorts of talk about abstinence pledges. There's all sorts of studies out there about how abstinence pledges don't work. And many of the students that I interviewed had taken abstinence pledges, and a lot of them actually, when I asked them, because you often get like some sort of a document that you sign, or some students got a key, and Anyway, there are all sorts of different cards. They have like wallet cards they're supposed to carry around saying that they signed this abstinence pledge. And a lot of the students had talked about how, yeah, they had taken one in 7th grade, but they had no idea where the card was. Or they had lost the certificate and it, got messed up in the move or something. So anyway, but one of the things that was very different was the promise rings. And I had originally thought abstinence pledges and promise rings were the same thing, but they're not. And promise rings are essentially a ring that a young woman gets from her father. And so many students had taken both abstinence pledges and were wearing promise rings. So, and you wear it on the engagement finger, so the ring finger of your left hand. And it's a fancy ring, generally. So it's like a ring with a stone on it. And so anyway, I had all kinds of discussions with women who are wearing these rings. And some of them told me, well, I got it because it was a really pretty ring, and I convinced my dad I'd stay chaste until I was married, but I wanted the ring. So, and I knew he'd buy me the ring if I told him that. So some of the students, it was just a great way to get a cool ring. But many of the students took this very seriously, and but it also caused a lot of anxiety among some of them. And Jessica was one of the women that was very intense for me to talk to about this, because she was very sad. So if you remember, Jessica hasn't kissed anybody, she never dated anybody, and she was one of the few students who had done True Love Waits, and she had her True Love Waits little card in her wallet with her. So anyway, so she was very devoted to this. But anyway, so I'll read this part, and then we'll open up for questions. So more meaningful to Jessica than the True Love Waits certificate is the promise ring given to her by her father that she wears proudly on the ring finger of her left hand. My dad gave it to me after taking the True Love Waits pledge, Jessica says. It means I'm already taken and I don't know who takes me, but even though I don't know who is going to be with me, it doesn't mean I can do what I want with my body. As Jessica's story implies, the role of the father is key within purity culture. Almost every woman I interviewed who wore a promise ring had received this gift from her father as a token not only of her responsibility to remain pure until marriage, but also of his responsibility to see to it that she does. A public sign of his duty to keep his daughter pure for her future husband. Upon a woman's engagement, this manly duty is passed down, in some measure, to the fiancé. In other words, promise rings are as much material symbols of a woman's vows as they are of a man's duty, of the father's pledge to serve as a sort of sexual watchdog, standing guard between his daughter and any potential suitors, or of the fiancé's pledge to resist his sexual urges and not take advantage of a woman's willingness to do anything she can, even give in to sex, to capture his heart. And I put a description of one of the really popular, they're purity balls, where fathers take their daughters and they get these rings that are they happen all over the United States. And there's a very, very popular one. And I think it gives a very good description of the role of the father. So the father-daughter purity ball is a memorable ceremony for fathers to sign commitments to be responsible men of integrity in all areas of purity. The commitment also includes their vow to protect their daughters in their choices for purity. The daughters silently commit to live pure lives before God through the symbol of laying down a white rose at the cross. Because we cherish our daughters as regal princesses, for 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 4 says, they are, quote, precious in the sight of God. We want to treat them as royalty. And so there really is this idea of the purity princess. And it's very passive for the women. So this is the part about Jessica that was, I think, very intense for me to hear. During our conversation, Jessica confesses something about her promise ring that reveals ambivalence. Because promise rings are worn on the left ring finger, where a woman traditionally wears an engagement ring, Jessica has taken to wearing the promise ring on her other hand, though during our interview it was on the left. I was thinking maybe no guys talk to me because I have it on my left hand, she admits. So I moved it to my right hand. Whether this form of resistance violates Jessica's vow to wait passively for God to choose her future husband is not clear, but it reveals something about Jessica that was also expressed by other women I interviewed. She fears that no men are interested in her, regardless of how cautiously she has guarded her prize. Like Emily, another student that I interviewed, Jessica may be a purity princess, but this sort of royalty is fraught with insecurity. She worries that her success at purity is not simply due to the fact that she is an especially good, godly girl, but instead because nobody wants her. Waiting for Prince Charming is not only emotionally difficult, it is lonely. And one of the biggest struggles I found with the evangelical young women is just this issue of I guard myself, and then what if nobody wants me eventually? And a sign of college success at evangelical colleges for young women was to be engaged by the time you graduate. And so there were slogans about this the students talked about, and one of them, I almost fell off my chair. I interviewed a guy. The first person I interviewed at evangelical college was a guy, and he sort of laughed. He was like, oh, ring by spring or your money back, when I was asking him about college campus. And I was like, ring by spring or your money back, what? And he talks about how, well, if girls don't have engagement rings on their fingers by the time they graduate, then they get their money back because they failed college. And I was like, what about you? Have you failed college if you're not engaged? And he's like, nah. So it was a thing for women. And the other thing that I heard a lot about was the senior scramble. And so it was this idea that women were scrambling to get that ring on their finger by the time they graduated. So there was this sense of they were all pouncing on the guys. And one of the things that the guys, and it was definitely this very difficult thing these women were navigating, because they're supposed to be passive, so they're not supposed to go after the guys in an active way. And a lot of the students talked about how frustrating that was. Somehow you're supposed to stand there like, look at me, here I am, marry me. But you're not supposed to ask them out, but somehow you're supposed to get them to marry you. So it was a very difficult situation. And the students I interviewed who were engaged when they were seniors were very, very proud of it. They were successful. And the students who were seniors and weren't engaged were really upset about it. It was very painful for them. And I remember interviewing one young man, actually, who was a senior, and he was really nervous because he had started dating this woman on campus, and he was going to break up with her because she was a senior. Because since she was a senior, he felt like, oh my gosh, I just have to decide to marry her right away, and so I've just got to break up with her. And so there was that sense of, senior women are, if you don't want to marry them, if you already know you don't want to marry them, you got to break up with them. So there was a lot of pressure in that sense on evangelical campuses. So I decided to talk about that purity culture, since for me this was though very different than hookup culture, as I'm sure you can imagine after me describing it. The pressures, I think, are very similar. And the stresses on students and the ways that they try to navigate, or ways that students try to navigate purity culture, are very similar to the ways I saw students on other campuses navigating hookup culture. It's just the experiences they have within them are very different with regard to sex. So anyway, I'm going to stop there, and I would love to answer questions that you have about this project, about purity culture, about other campuses. Yes?
I went to Fairfield University for 2 years as an undergraduate, and I encountered a lot of that when I was there, that girls would openly admit that they enrolled in these Catholic schools, and it's like, especially Fairfield, to find a husband. Like, did you find that on any other campuses?
Oh, I did not hear that at all on Catholic campuses.
Really?
Not a single person actually talked about that on the Catholic campuses I visited. Marriage felt very, very far away to most students, and they were more interested in just finding a stable relationship. And one of the things that actually came up, I asked all the students if they knew, if they said that they were a particular faith tradition. So if a student said they were Catholic in an interview, at the end of the interview, I would say, well, can you tell me what the Catholic Church teaches about sex? What did you learn about dating? From within the context of your faith tradition growing up. And most of the students just laughed and just said, oh, sex is bad. And that was it. And, or they would say, sometimes they would say, well, you're supposed to save sex for marriage, but that's ridiculous. And I'm not getting married until I'm like 35, or 30 or whatever. So I didn't hear that at all. It was really, but it was extremely, I can't tell you, every single student I interviewed at evangelical colleges talked about marriage and talked about this ring by spring, senior scramble, like, will I find a husband? Like, will a woman try to trap me? So that was very common. Other questions? Yes, Peter.
Is the purity thing almost entirely about women? Is the man who opens the present on the marriage night supposed to be as clueless as she is?
Yes, he is actually, ideally. And that was, I would say that publicly, women have a much harder time with purity culture in terms of if they fail or if they trip up somehow, they can experience a lot. They're not so easily forgiven, I would say. So there's a double standard that's that you see everywhere else. So women I think have a more perilous situation, and if they get a reputation for having had sex or having been someone, that can. I talked a lot about how no one will want to date me because if they find out I've had sex. And so I'm ruined. I won't be able to find a good Christian guy. No one will want to be with me because what if he's pure and I'm not? And guys talked just as much as women did about struggling to maintain purity. So I had, I think one of the guys I talked about, I think it's in here, his first line to me is really telling. Oh, he said, sometimes I think it's incredible that I'm still a virgin. So that was his first line to me, and I was like, really? So tell me about that. And then I had another student who, I wonder if I can find him. He was telling me about, this was a student who had dated his girlfriend for a year. They decided they could kiss after a year. So they waited for a year for the first kiss, and then they started kissing, and it was all downhill from there. And he was like, we make, sometimes we can just hold hands now sitting on a bench. Like that was sort of where they were during the interview, and we've tried just kissing standing up, and then kissing laying down, but not on top of each other, and kissing like laying on top of each other, but with clothes on. Like they tried all these different things, and nothing was working. They couldn't stop themselves. But they were very, the guys were just as concerned with being spiritually pure. However, if they had sex, it was okay for them to talk about it in a public way. But I did have several people talk about how, they were guys too, who talked about how they were really nervous about what was going to happen on their wedding night if they didn't know what they were doing. And so some of them had asked married couples who had sort of done the first kiss at the altar thing. And generally there were a couple of people who waxed poetically about it and talked about how it was wonderful and the fairy tale, but they did have a lot of conversations about how it was a disaster. It was over in 30 seconds, and one person left really unhappy, and it was understood that was the woman. And so there was also a lot of excitement though about getting to your wedding night, and there was a tradition on one of the campuses, because there were a lot of engaged people, where guys, this was a guy thing too, it wasn't a girl thing, they kept calendars, and they would mark off the days until they were having sex. And so it was literally, it was chains, that's what it was. They made chains, those, like paper chains like I did for Christmas when I was growing up and put them on the tree. They're probably a fire hazard. Anyway, so they would make chains, that's what it was, and they would put them up around their room, and they would take off a chain, as the chain got shorter, all their friends knew that they were getting closer to their wedding night. And one of the things that all the books promise, because there's I think it's the third floor here, there's a whole Christian inspiration section, and you can find many, many books on, I guess, the sort of culture of sexual restraint written by young evangelicals. And one of the things that's very clear is the sexual promises once you get to the altar are fantastic. And so there's a lot of talk about how great sex is going to be if you're going to wait. And if you stay pure until you get to the altar, your wife is going to be so happy. She's going to do all sorts of things for you. So there's that sense of they get this kind of reward if they make it to the altar, even if they don't know what they're doing. So there's anxiety, there's excitement, there's rituals around like anticipating it. But there is a kind of fear of what if I get there and I don't know what I'm doing, or what if I'm terrible. So, yes.
I'm interested because the genesis of the project came out of a class of 20 women. I'm interested what the male perspectives were in terms of hooking up and what they felt.
That's a really great question, and actually the course I taught at BU based on the study last semester had almost all women, though I think we had 3 men. Right? 3 men, maybe? And one of them sitting on the floor over there, or standing there in the back. But in general, it seems like, and I have another friend who teaches a relationships class at that same college, and it's always women who sign up. So it seems like women want to have this conversation. But in the study, on evangelical campuses, just as many women and men wanted to have the conversation, so they signed up for the interview. They put themselves forward as possible candidates for the interview. And I had almost 600 students volunteer for the interview, which I was like hoping for I don't know, 100 volunteers so I could get about 40 interviews, and I ended up with 600 volunteers, and I ended up interviewing 111 or 112 students, and I would have interviewed more, but I'm only one person. So, but on the non-evangelical campuses, about 2/3 of the volunteers were women for the interview, and the only thing I selected for when I was trying to pick who was going to interview was gender. I wanted to try to get it even. So I interviewed about equal numbers of men and women. And with regard to hookup culture, so I'm talking non-evangelical campuses here, with a very few exceptions, both men and women on campus expressed that wanting the exact same thing, which is romantic relationships. And women complained about how hookup culture wasn't allowing them to really engage, and they couldn't go on dates, and they want to go on dates. They couldn't have really successful or fulfilling relationships. It was hard to get into a relationship because you had to hook up with a whole bunch of different people before maybe you could start a serial hookup, which would maybe turn into a relationship. And this is because the guys don't want them. And then behind closed doors, I had all these guys who were talking about how, there's all this pressure for guys to be a player. And so, to assert your masculinity on campus, this is sort of what they were concerned about, to be a guy, you had to hook up with a lot of women. And so they didn't actually feel like they wanted to hook up so much either. They wanted relationships, except they felt like they were going to lose their credibility on campus if they didn't sort of live up to this player reputation. And I heard over and over again, and I think this is from American Pie, but about the rule of 3, which is women divide how many partners they've had by 3. So if a woman tells you she's had 3 partners, that means she's had 9. And if a guy tells you he's had 9 partners, that means he's only had 3. And so there's this pressure publicly for guys to be like, yeah, I want to hook up, girls, they're stupid, whatever, But behind closed doors, they were complaining about how, like, I want to have a fulfilling relationship and I can't. So I think that, to me, that's really important for students on campuses to know. Since, again, that's one of those disconnects. Like, oh, yeah, I pretend I like hookup culture, but actually I really hate it, but I say I like it. And then everybody else does the same thing. It's like, oh, well, I pretend, guys pretend they want to be hooking up all the time when really they want a relationship. So men and women are very similar. You all want to date each other. So you know.
I found that across the board, even like, for instance, at a big...
Didn't matter where. Across the board, guy after guy, sensitive guys everywhere. So, yeah, wanting relationships. There were a couple of really startling students who I think a lot of people have asked me, like, well, where is hookup culture coming from if students don't really like it? And I have a couple of theories. And well, one, of course, the sexually explicit American culture we're in, Paris Hilton culture, all these young Hollywood starlets, dancing on stripper poles, etc., and all sorts of very explicit sexual images. Young women, I think, in celebrity culture and in the music world are products themselves. They're products who are made as sex objects, and they are held up as the ideals women are supposed to emulate. So that's part of, I think a lot of that contributes to it. But also it seems like there's a very small group of students, let's say 15%, I don't know, of students on campus who are super popular, either in their cliques on big campuses or just, on small campuses, just on the whole campus. They're super popular, super loud, and super dominant. And they love hooking up. And they throw the parties. They throw the pimps and hoes parties and CEOs and office hoes and all the stuff I've heard about. And because they're so loud and so confident and so sort of powerful on campus, they sort of maintain this rumor that hookup culture is what everybody wants, and somehow everybody else kind of plays along with it, even though they don't really like it so much. And it's often not until students are juniors or seniors that they start to question it or feel like they can question it or feel empowered to. And it's first-year students that are most vulnerable because they come in, they're swept up into it, and the seniors take them right along, those powerful senior men especially, just pick on those. I mean, I heard about that a lot, just sort of preying on the first-year girls especially, and just sort of roping them right in. And it's not until like several years later that they wake up and realize, like, wait a minute, like what's this all about? So I think there is this sort of upper echelon of student that dominates. But there was do you still have your question, and then I'll go to the front here.
I was just wondering if you looked at the relationship between drinking and the hookup culture, because the stories I hear has always been, well, I got wicked drunk and then slept with this guy or slept with this girl, and then now I feel really bad about it. Like, was that in your questionnaire, in your survey?
It's like the whole of my intro. The intro tells the story of one particular student, Amy Stone, that I met at a Catholic college. It tells basically her whole story, because I felt like her entire story really raised basically all the different issues I was looking at on campus, whether we were talking about sex and hookup culture and dating and romance, or religion and spirituality, and how those two things go together. And she talked so much about how without alcohol, nobody would ever get together. And there was this sense of, alcohol is how you get together with people on campus. It's the catalyst for everything, for all relationships, for all hooking up. Often long-term relationships, so people who had been dating for 2 years at colleges, and I'm bracketing evangelicals here because they really don't have much drinking on campus, actually. So they were all dry campuses that I went to, the evangelical colleges, and they always talk about how there's a few students who drink, but really people don't drink. And really I didn't really interview people who drank. So, but on everywhere else, there was this sort of sense that, of course, that's how relationships start. Like, long-term relationships start pretty much drunk for 6 months. And, otherwise, how in the world do you get up the guts to talk to somebody or to communicate with them? And so a lot of initial communication and sexual relationships seems to happen intoxicated and also very casually in terms of with people you don't know. And if it turns into something, it's after a lot of alcohol, a lot of casual sex, and a kind of, the serial hookup, which is you keep running into the same person at a party for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then eventually after like weeks and weeks and weeks or months of hooking up, you're like, oh, hey, I like you, kind of. So, and that turns into a relationship. But alcohol was, especially with when students discuss the pimps and hoes party culture, and tennis hoes, was it golf pros and tennis hoes and hoes and hoes and hoes. That was a big thing for the women, is getting drunk on your way out the door so that you can sort of show up all showing everything, I guess. So, yeah.
So I have 2 questions. First of all, I'm wondering if you can just sort of talk about the opposite of purity, and if you interviewed any students that felt that they had found themselves or found spirituality through sex and through sexual relationships. And also, if you'd be willing to talk a little bit more about students that admitted or recognized the fact that their parents had a lot to do with whatever they believed, and how students either left that behind or held on to that.
Both good questions. I'll answer the second one first, which is, I think with regard to religion, most of the students I interviewed who weren't on evangelical campuses were pretty annoyed at their parents about religion. And so it was sort of, they shoved it down my throat, and, I'm mad at, I hate them for it, or that is so annoying, I don't want to deal with it anymore, now I'm spiritual. And I was thinking during the study, actually, parents are damned if they do and damned if they don't, because I also interviewed students whose parents didn't bring them up with anything, and they were really bummed because all their students were struggling, all their other friends were struggling with God and all kinds of things, or their faith, and they didn't have anything to struggle with. So I was like, if you bring up with your kids without anything, they're going to be mad at you. If you bring them up with something, they're going to be mad at you. So go figure. But I think some of the students, actually, with regard to romantic relationships, they talked about, and including the student in the beginning, Amy, who's in the intro, she talked about how, my parents met when they were in college. I heard that a lot. My parents met when they were in college. I thought that, I was going to have this big love affair when I was in college and meet the man of my dreams. And even if they didn't think they were going to get married for a long time, they had very romantic notions about what relationships would be like in college, partly from what their parents talked about. And so there was a sense of disappointment that it wasn't there, that they weren't experiencing it. But also this sense of, I can't tell my parents what I'm doing here. And, they're out of the house now, and they're engaging in all sorts of behaviors that if their parents found out, they would die. And so there was that sense of, because I asked all the students, like, do you talk to your parents about this? And they were like, no. So it was not, like, it's not the students don't talk to their parents about meaningful issues, but they don't talk about this particular kind of behavior. So, for example, I had just written about this. Like, can you imagine? I'm just thinking, like, I don't know, maybe some of you go to these theme parties. Like, I can't even. Well, I didn't even tell my dad I have a book called Sex and the Soul. So, so I wouldn't be, if I was dressing up like a whore to go to a party, I probably wouldn't be like, yeah, last night we went to a Prince and Hose party. So that kind of discussion isn't happening. Yeah. And parents are very startled when I talk about that part. But what was your first question again? I'm sorry.
Sort of the opposite of purity, and I was asking if they ever found themselves or found religion through sex.
Yes, I did. I asked every student who had had some sort of sexual experience, however it ranged. One of the things I asked them, have you ever experienced, would you ever call one of your sexual experiences also a spiritual experience, or I can't remember how I phrased it exactly, but I asked them to talk about that. Have you ever, is sex a spiritual experience for you? And a lot of students, upon reflection, could talk about a moment that they could remember of being with someone that they would call spiritual. And so the student in the intro, actually, she talks about how it was actually during a hookup. So she had never had a boyfriend. She wanted a boyfriend, but she hooked up with lots of guys because she couldn't get a boyfriend where she went to school. So she talked about how there was this one moment where she was with a guy and they'd been hooking up, and then they ended up laying in bed, and they were looking into each other's eyes for a really long time. And they started talking, and she said that there was this sort of eye-to-eye contact that was just really meaningful, and she would call it spiritual. And I had a number of students who, upon reflection, were able to talk about a moment they had had with a significant other, or a moment where they just felt this really intense connection, and it happened in a sort of sexual intimacy, that they would call spiritual. And so that was something the students were really excited to think about and discuss. However, in every single one of those situations, I would ask the students, so did you decide this together, that this was a spiritual moment? Or did you talk about it after? Did you tell the person, wow, that was spiritual? Or, this was really meaningful to me. I would almost call it like a religious experience, or it has spiritual significance to me. And even with students who were in long-term relationships, talked about how, no, they didn't express that. They would never say that. They would feel too embarrassed to say it. So actually naming it outside of themselves, like to the other person, was really absent, I would say. So I think what I found on a lot of campuses was there was excitement about associating spirituality with their sex lives or their romantic lives, with students' romantic lives. There was a sort of sense of also, this is kind of, I don't know how to do that, I'd like to do it, and then if I do it, I can't actually tell anybody. So there's a lot of interest there, but also a lot of nervousness about really affirming it, like with the other person. So I would say that kind of spiritual connection it's sort of incomplete. It's very much, it's in that one person and not necessarily expressed to the other person. Chris?
Did you find that this sort of angst over romance and religion was as pervasive for students who identified as gay or bisexual as it was for straight students?
It depended on, I interviewed a range of students with regard to this issue. And there was a student on one bisexual evangelical young woman I interviewed at an evangelical college was just sort of like, I can tell anybody I'm bisexual, woohoo! She felt very, she had decided she was bisexual when she got to campus. She'd also decided she was a feminist. She was very experiencing all kinds of doubts about her faith, but very excited about her faith. And so she was very open. But then, for example, there was also, there was another student I interviewed who was, he was the most difficult interview I had, in the sense that he was a young man who was, I would say that he was gay, but he went back and forth during our interview about 100 different times saying, well, I've only had experiences with men, but I'm not gay, and I know I need to marry a woman, but I think women are disgusting. And I mean, he went back and forth, and he never ever called himself gay. And he was the only student where there were just basic sort of demographic questions I asked at the beginning of every interview, like, can you please tell me how old you are, what year you are, what is your sexual orientation, what's your religious background? And generally students ticked these off without thinking. And he was this one student who I asked, what's your sexual orientation? And he just stopped. And he paused for like 3 minutes. And I just waited, and I asked him about that. He was the only person I actually asked about. Generally, I just left it as demographic information. But I said, I have to ask you. You really hesitated, and he was like, no. I'm not gay, and he was really, really stressed about it. And so it was very intense to see, I guess, him wrestle with his Christian identity, which was really in the way of his, I think, coming to terms with his sexual identity. And he was mortified by it as well. He had felt like he had just fallen in the eyes of God because he was struggling in this way. I think there were on other campuses, on non-evangelical campuses, I found students who were really excited about spirituality and exploring, I think, all sorts of different ways of expressing it, outside of traditional contexts. But I think it was very difficult. It was rare to meet students who were very comfortable expressing, being gay, lesbian, bisexual in a religious context. So there was generally a conflict, except for that one student. So, yeah.
How were students coping with their anxiety if they were that nobody would date them, if they would wear a chastity ring?
Some of the women were just mad. I don't know. I don't know how they were coping, really. Some of them were just very... I think some of them were sad, and some of them were just like, this is just really unfair. Like, we're not... How are we supposed to get guys if we're not allowed to express our feelings or if we like someone? So I don't know. I think it's really hard. And the women, actually, a lot of the women were the heads of student government. And one of the things that they were doing on these campuses were, so they would plan all these campus events. And I can't remember what they call these events, but they kept sponsoring all these events where it was like, guys ask a girl out night or something. And so the women were in charge of student government, and they were sponsoring events where guys were expected to ask a woman out, and they kept sponsoring them all across campus. So it was like, come on guys, come on, like, we're having this event, ask me out. So they that's one of the ways that they were dealing with it. Maybe we'll just do one more question, and then, because you guys have been all so lovely, and I don't know how long this has taken, so I don't know. How about right there?
You're just talking about the boy struggling with his sexual orientation in regards to his religious orientation. I was just wondering, could you talk about some of the differences you found in people accepting their sexual orientation, like within different religions that you studied?
Most of the students that I interviewed who identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual had come from a Christian background. And so, are you just asking, like, how are they?
Like, is there a difference between Catholics and evangelicals, or whatever divisions of Christianity?
I guess I would have to, the students that I interviewed on evangelical campuses were Christian, period. And, some of them talked about how they were spiritual but not religious, but they were still very much operating in terms of a Christian context. Like, that's what they were still very committed to Christianity and the sort of Christian worldview and lifestyle, even if they were struggling with it. But I would say pretty much everybody else identified as spiritual but not religious. And so it was sort of like institutional religion, not for me. I'm spiritual and I'm figuring this out as I go, and I'm trying to find like new communities where I can express this. So I would say that they had just they were just like, oh, well, I'll say I'm Catholic because I grew up Catholic, but I don't act Catholic. Like that, there's no space for me in that tradition. So that tended to be how they identified, I guess, just spiritual but not religious. So I'm going to stop there because you've all been so wonderful, and for staying here this evening. Thank you so much for coming. For those of you who are students, I'm on campus at BU, and I always love visitors. Or if you want to email me and ask me questions if you didn't get a chance, please do. It's just Freitas@bu.edu, or come by my office. And or take my classes. So anyway, thank you for coming tonight, and I'm happy to sign books if you actually want to buy one. So.